Hello, this is Donovan Doust, probably better known in the poker community as Navanad. Welcome to the Tao of continuation betting, or the Tao of C betting, or TTOC. In part one of my continuation bet series, I'm going to define what exactly a continuation bet is. We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of C betting, and really we're going to examine continuation betting from a conceptual level. And I'm going to be asking a couple questions that I think are very fair questions to ask, but that are neglected and not asked very often. I'm going to be asking the question, should pre-flop caller tend to check to the razor post-flop? And ought pre-flop razor default continuation bet the flop when pre-flop caller checks to pre-flop razor on the flop? And if so, why? So does it make sense to check to the razor? Does it make sense to default c-bet as pre-flop razor? Before we can discuss any of this, I think we need to have a definition. I think most people know what a continuation bet is, but there's a little bit of a difference of opinion from one player to the next. I understand most of these differences are arbitrary, but I still think it's a good idea to make sure that we're all on the same page, and so that we don't get into any semantic problems. So, for instance, one player might say that if you bet a flop and then you bet again on the turn, you are making a continuation bet on the turn. And I think that's fine and okay, but not for the video series. I think some people might consider a continuation bet to be any bet made as the first bet post-flop as the pre-flop razor. So for instance, if pre-flop razor is called pre-flop and the flop goes check check and then pre-flop razor bets the turn, maybe that could be called a continuation bet. And again, that's fine, but not for this series. For our purposes, a continuation bet must necessarily be made by the pre-flop razor, must be made on the flop, and it must be the first bet to go in on the flop. So essentially, if you open raise or you 3-bet and are called, and you are either out of position and you lead into the pot on the flop, or you are checked to and you bet the flop, you've made a continuation bet. That's a C bet for this series. One of the big things, and if you read my introduction article, you probably have some idea of where I'm going and how I plan to get there. But one of the big reasons I wanted to make this video series because I feel like there's a lot of unnecessary confusion behind continuation betting and correct c-bet strategy. And I think what happens is we kind of, as poker players, elevate continuation betting into an unrealistic status where we think of c-betting almost as its own sort of magical, special type of bet, when in reality, it's really not that much different than any other bet made on any other street. Sure, it has its own peculiarities, but any bet made on any street is going to have its own set of peculiarities. So yes, it does have some special qualities. Pre-flop razor, when he bets the flop, is kind of bridging the gap between pre-flop and post-flop play. And there's also, I think, a little bit of, I don't know if I want to use the word nostalgia, but there's a little bit of a connection in our minds still from way back in like 2005, 6, 2007, that era, where we were just printing money with our continuation bets. And while continuation betting and effective continuation betting is still really one of the hinge pins of virtually every single profitable player's overall poker strategy, I still think that, bottom line, a bet is just a bet, and a continuation bet is not really going to be that much different from any other bet made on any other street. So, the basics of c-betting are, just like with any other bet, we are going to tend to bet for a value when we think we probably have the best hand and we think that villain's going to have enough second best hands to call with. So we can continuation bet to be called by worse hands, or we can c-bet our error when we miss the flop, expecting to fold out better hands, so we can c-bet as a bluff. Basically, we're betting as a value bet, or we're betting as a bluff most of the time. But I don't think that's the whole story. And I came up with sort of a toy game to illustrate the principles that I wanted to illustrate, and really to highlight and exemplify some of the ideas that I think, while not entirely incorrect, are at least incomplete, and that I think are held by very many otherwise pretty good and sometimes even top level players. So this is the C-bet game, and if you're not familiar with a toy game is simply it's a game made to sort of simplify a complex situation by keeping the essentials and getting rid of all the non-essentials, and then making a game out of it. So in our toy game, we're playing heads up against another player. Player A and player B are playing heads up, one street poker. Each player will start with, and this is going to be arbitrary, but we'll just say for the sake of simplicity or concreteness, each player starts with 50 units. Doesn't matter what the units are, matchsticks, $100 bills, 50 units, 50 big blinds. Player A, that we're going to call button, is going to start with one of the hands that he would typically open raise the button with if the action folded to him in, let's just say, again, arbitrarily, but for the sake of concreteness, let's say in a 6-max setting. Player A is going to open raise all of the hands that he would open raise if the action were folded to him in a 6-max setting. So he's going to be dealt at random in this toy game one of his open raised from button hands. Player B, who's going to be called big blind in this toy game, is going to be randomly dealt any one of the hands that he would default flat call out of the big blind when facing an open raise from the button at 6-max. Again, kind of arbitrarily, just picked 6-max out of thin air, but it just for the sake of clarity, it's probably necessary to make sure these guys are both playing the same game. So player A, again, he's dealt one of the hands at random that he would default open raise at a 6-max game, and player B is dealt one of the hands that he would tend to flat call out of the big blind after the button opens and assuming the small blind folds. So he's going to be randomly dealt one of the hands that he would not 3-bet with or fold facing a button raise. If I was player B, I would be dealt a hand like King Jack or King 10 suited, maybe Ace 10, pocket 8s, something in that ballpark. So player A and player B are both randomly dealt their starting hands, and then all of their would-be dead cards, whatever they weren't dealt, is just shuffled back into the deck, and a random flop is dealt out. Now, player B, even though he's considered big blind and thought to be out of position or first to act after the flop, he has a forced check option in this toy game. Because remember, this toy game is meant to simulate the continuation bet dynamic, the check to the raiser, bet as raiser dynamic. So player B does not get an option, he has a forced check option. Then player A has the first and only option in the toy game. He can bet or he can check, and the betting is going to be no limit for the sake of argument. It could be pot limit, it could be whatever, but for our toy game it's no limit style betting. So 2 random hands are dealt out of each player's normal default ranges from their particular positions. The dead cards or would-be dead cards are shuffled back into the deck. Flop is dealt, a random flop is dealt. Player B auto checks. Player A can either check back, in which case the hand goes directly to showdown, and whoever has the best hand wins. Or player A can decide to bet any amount up to his 50 unit stack. He can bet, well, no limit style, into this 2-unit pot. And then if he decides to bet, player B has the option to either call or fold. If player B folds, player A gets the 2-unit pot. If player B calls, then they go to showdown. They just turn their hands over. Whoever has the best hand wins the pot, and that is that. And my question is, this is what I want you to think about. How closely does this emulate our actual situation in No Limit Hold'em when we are either the button who raises or the big blind that calls and we see a flop? Think about that for a moment. Let's talk a little bit about what player A's strategy would be in this toy game. And I think, now I haven't solved the equilibrium strategy for this, but I don't think you have to be a game theory expert to understand most of the implications here. Player A's strategy is obviously going to involve always betting his strong value hands, and exactly how we define a strong value hand is going to depend a lot on whatever player A thinks player B's range is like and the board texture and things like that. But he's always going to be betting like top pair, top kicker. He's probably always going to be betting his second pairs, at least second pairs with a good kicker on most boards. He's going to be betting anytime he thinks that if he is called, he is going to be the winner more times than not. That's a value hand. That's sort of the definition of a value bet, right? So he's always going to value bet when he has the opportunity to value bet. Then he's also going to take a lot of his complete air, and he's going to use those hands to bluff with. But what he's not going to do is he's not going to bet his mediocre hands like bottom pair, sometimes ace high, depending on the texture, that could win at showdown, but will rarely be called by worse or fold out better hands. And although this is probably a little bit beyond the scope of the video, player A's exact strategy is going to be, well, it's going to depend on his bet sizing, but if we make it pot size, let's say he's just betting 2 units every time, player A is going to be bluffing just often enough to keep player B indifferent between calling and folding with his bluff catchers, and player B should then be calling with his bluff catchers just often enough to keep player A indifferent or breaking even between bluffing or not bluffing with his air. And I don't think I'm going to get too far into that, but that's going to be pretty close to the exact. I think that's going to be their exact game theory optimal strategies in this toy game. So ought this be our strategy when we get to the flop, either in or out of the lead, when we're playing not in this toy game, but in real no limit hold'em poker? And that's not just the where I'm going with this video, but that's really going to be the point of the video series. And I think you can do a lot worse than to have this mentality when you're playing, and especially if you're playing heads up, but just in general, that we should tend to bet our errors a bluff, and we should tend to bet our strong value hands, and we should tend to check back hands that are not strong enough to value bet, but too strong to bet as a bluff. But is that the entirety of it? Value bet when we expect to be called by worse, bluff when we think we can get enough folds. Is that the entire thing? Should we value bet or bluff, or else check back? Should we always do this? Should we do this as default? Is that the whole deal? And in my opinion, that's not it. That's not the entirety. And I know, again, a lot of good players play exactly this way. I know a lot of very good heads-up players that at least play this way default. They at least start the matches. Most of the good regs I play a lot of heads-up matches. And when I'm playing a heads-up match, I can usually tell pretty quickly when I'm playing against a decent reg or regular heads-up player, because I see him checking back things like bottom pair on the flop and ace high, and I see him kind of c-betting a more polarized range. But in 6-max or even full ring games, I don't think this is going to be the best way to play. And even heads up against another thinking player, I still don't think that we should be polarizing our c-bet range. I think it's going to have some implications, not just moving forward in the hand, but also backing up to pre-flop play. So our actions on this street when we play the flop, however we play the flop, is obviously going to have an effect on how the rest of the hand plays out. Later streets, hand equities are going to change. The way that we play this street is going to have an effect on what range our opponents show up with on later streets. And there's a lot that goes into c-betting or not c-betting that toy game does not account for. So that toy game can't possibly be the end-all be-all. And I don't think it requires an extreme amount of imagination to understand how our flop play is going to have an effect on later street play. But what may not be quite so intuitive or obvious is that our flop c-bet percentage is going to have an effect on how profitable or how unprofitable we're playing before the flop. And let me say that again because I think that's important. The way that we play on the flop is going to affect our overall profitability even pre-flop. For instance, if we're playing against players that want to look at too many flops, they're too loose before the flop, and we're playing an exploitative style, so we're tightening up our open raise ranges and our ISO raise ranges. If we are starting with the best hand and we are charging our opponent an unfair price to draw against our assuming best hand, or usually best hand, and we get to the flop, even when we get to a flop where it's hard for us to imagine being called by worse hands or getting better hands to fold, not making a continuation bet on that flop, and especially if our opponent is drawing live against us, is, and I mean absolutely, unequivocally, definitely is, a negative EV leak according to the fundamental theorem of poker. Now, I'm not going to say that it's not a leak that we can make up for, or that we can't make up for. I know there are going to be a lot of spots where we're going to check back things like top pair with a weak kicker, or maybe like pocket kings on ace rag rag. But we're doing that because even though we're making a fundamental theorem of poker mistake on this street, we expect that we're going to be able to make that value back up on future streets. But if we're not going to be able to make more money than we are leaking off when we fail to bet what is probably the best hand on the flop, that money leak is going to come up somewhere. And everything is so interwoven and interconnected in No Limit Hold'em. Sometimes it's hard to really figure out or intuitively understand where that money leak is going to come from. But actually, a lot of the money that you're leaking by not c-betting when your opponent is drawing live against you, but you cannot see yourself getting called by worse or getting better hands to fold on the flop, is actually going to go back to pre-flop play, where you have made a raise that was plus EV, and your opponent has made a call that was negative EV, but then you failed to lock that equity up on the flop by allowing your opponent to see a fourth card for the price that was sort of agreed upon pre-flop for 3 cards to see the flop. So yeah, basically what I'm saying is we are playing poker, and as per usual on poker, it depends. Should we play our c-bet game in-game in real poker? Should we play like we would play in that c-bet game? Well, here's some things to understand. There absolutely definitely is value in folding out villain's equity anytime they are drawing live against you. Anyone who tells you otherwise is just dead wrong. There is also value in inducing mistakes, like under-repping second pair or top pair with a weak kicker on the flop in order to induce bluffs or light call downs on later streets. And there's value just in getting near a showdown with a marginal hand and giving yourself a chance to realize your showdown value, especially when you're in position and you have a chance maybe to get to showdown with something that is likely going to be the best hand right up until the point where you bet and are called. But there's also value in having a proper c-bet percentage. Polarizing your c-bets can be extremely effective, and it is an exploitative strategy against, and it works against a large percent of the player pool at, say, small stakes heads up sit and goes, or even small stakes heads up cash games. But a polar c-bet range absolutely can be exploited, and if you don't think so, imagine the following scenario. Imagine that you're polarizing your c-bet range, meaning you're only betting, say, pretty darn strong hands on the flop, or you're betting your air. What if you run into a player who every single time you check the flop back when you have the betting lead, bombs the turn for like 1.5 times the size of the pot and jams all rivers? Are you ever going to be able to call him down? Or what if you end up facing a ton of small check raises? So yeah, when you're betting a polarized c-bet range, that can be really good against players that play bad, but it can also be very bad against players who kind of see it coming or are able to sniff it out and know how to exploit it. C-betting is part of poker, and almost anything in poker is going to have this same answer. If you ask a poker question, the answer is going to be it depends. That's why this is my c-bet series and not my c-bet video. So let's go back to the evolution of the continuation bet. And I remember playing in 2006, so let's go back to circa 2006. I want to talk about the way we looked at the game, the way I looked at the game, thought about the game, and really the flow of the game, the way the game played back then. Way back in 2006. It was sort of like we were telling a story, or really better put, we were having or participating in a conversation. And a raise was sort of meant to convey the statement, based on my position and the number of players left behind me, I believe my hand is the best hand, and therefore I am entitled to the money in the pot. So I'm going to take the money in the pot unless you want to take the price that I'm laying you to draw against my hand. That's what was meant by a raise, by an open raise. If your opponent, or if a player 3-bet in 2006, well, okay, I guess a player would not have 3-bet in 2006, he would have re-raised you. But no, if a player 3-bet in, circa 2006-ish, that 3-bet could have been interpreted as the statement, I understand that you're representing a strong hand, but I still believe that my hand is stronger than most of the hands you would raise in that position, so I'm going to take the pot down unless you would like to take the price that I'm going to lay you to draw against my presumably premium hand. Now a call, back in this old school paradigm, and this is important, a call did not mean anything like I think I have the best hand or I'm ahead of your range. A call simply meant my hand is too strong to fold, but it's not strong enough to raise with. I'm going to take the price that you're laying and see what develops on the flop. Most of the time, a call was a speculative drawing hand. In 2006, most decent, I guess if you wanted to call them decent players, they were mostly kind of what I call an OS tag, like old school tight aggressive player. They tended to play very raise or fold pre-flop and just flat call with pocket pairs to set mine and suited connectors to see if they could flop something. So that call was only a call for express odds and or implied odds based on this sort of agreement that you'd entered into, that you were going to get to see 3 cards before the continuation bet came. Now, if you think about it, back in 2006, before players were floating or peeling, check raising light, doing a lot of kind of fancy or new school things, they were normally just checking and they would just play fit or fold to a c-bet. If you couple that with the fact that the bet sizing tended to be smaller back then, about half the size of the pot was standard, then you can see why c-betting was just printing money. It's just not that way anymore. But if we look at the continuation bet through the lenses of a circa 2006 professional, we can see why a continuation bet made sense and printed money. A continuation bet was not really even representing making a hand on the flop or improving. A continuation bet was simply that, a continuation of the strength that you've already shown pre-flop. We figured in 2006 if our opponent thought he had a better hand than us, he would re-raise us before the flop. So since he called, he sort of entered into this agreement that he was either going to improve on the flop or he was going to check and fold most of the time. So to not see bet back then was just kind of like saying, I know that we set the price at, well, usually 2-to-1 pot size bet or around there, for you to see the flop. And I know that you agreed to pay that price to see 3 cards, but I'm kind of feeling generous today, so I'm going to give you one more card to improve to beat me, and it really was just burning money. Now, the more I know that was an antiquated view. I know that was an old school way to look at it, but it definitely leads us or led us to this spot where we ought to have been c-betting a tremendous amount of the time. From a more modern perspective, does it still make sense when we think more along the lines of ranges and hand distributions? Well, in the modern perspective, pre-flop raiser's range is going to tend to be wider, but it's going to tend to be uncapped. It's not going to be as narrowly defined. It's not going to be bound, and it's not going to be capped. And when I'm talking about bound and capped ranges, I just mean that a hand range that is capped or is bound, it can be capped at some threshold hand or bound at some threshold hand. Bound just means the hand can only be so bad, and capped means that the hand can only be so good. So if preflop raiser raises and is called, the caller has a capped range. The caller doesn't have pocket aces, or the caller would have 3-bet preflop. The caller is not representing a range of kings, aces, ace, king most of the time. Preflop caller is also, however, not bluffing. So preflop caller is going to have a mostly mediocre kind of value merged range that is going to be overall stronger than the preflop raiser's range, just based on the gap concept. Takes a better hand to call a raise than to make a raise, but preflop raiser's range is uncapped, and it's wide, harder to read, less defined, and that's really where this continuation bet dynamic maybe not comes from, but it's why it has stood the test of time. Pre-flop raiser's wider range creates more incentive to bet on more flops. There's almost never going to be a flop. There may never be a flop that pre-flop raiser cannot represent a value hand on. But there are going to be some flops that pre-flop caller is going to have a pretty hard time repping anything of serious or significant value. Pre-flop raiser is always going to have pocket aces in his range. Pre-flop caller cannot usually represent pocket aces. Pre-flop raiser can have ace king, pocket queens, tons of things, and he can have jack 10 suited or jack 9 offsuit. Pre-flop caller usually is going to have something a little bit more mediocre than that. So pre-flop caller is going to have a range pre-flop that tends to flop more medium straight hands post-flop. Pre-flop raiser is going to have a range that, since it's wider, it's going to flop more air. But since it's less defined, it's going to be able to represent more value hands on more flops. So with more air and the ability to represent more value hands on more flops, pre-flop raiser can almost always find a reason to bet on just about any flop. So, and the more raises and re-raises, the more polarized pre-flop raiser's range becomes, and the more narrowly defined but strong pre-flop caller's range becomes. So yeah, in modern terms, it actually really does still make sense to c-bet. This c-bet dynamic just comes from pre-flop raiser's range is wide, undefined, polar, uncapped, and will have more big value, more air on more flops. More big value and more air equals more incentive to bet. Pre-flop caller's range is going to be narrow, bound, capped, more mediocre, more value merged, and it's going to have less incentive for aggression. It's going to have more showdown value, less nutted value. It's going to have more something, less nothing. So that wide, uncapped range and somewhat polarized range versus mediocre pre-flop ranges, they're going to lead to more polar versus bluff catcher situations post-flop, and it's just the nature of the equity distribution that leads to check to the raiser, bet as raiser, c-bet dynamic. So there you have it. The c-bet dynamic is still good and true, and it still makes sense an awful lot of the time to default check to the raiser and default bet as raiser. In fact, as pre-flop caller, all you really need to know, especially when you're out of position, or I would say specifically when you're out of position, All you need to know in order to default check to the raiser is that pre-flop raiser will have a lot of incentive to bet a lot of flops a lot of the time with a lot of his range. If you know that pre-flop raiser is going to make a continuation bet a very high percent of the time, you're probably not going to be very incentivized to lead into pre-flop raiser with your nutted value hands like top set. Top set's going to play better as check to the raiser. Let the raiser c-bet, decide to check raise him there or maybe on a later street or slow play or whatever. But you're not going to have much incentive to bet a value hand into a player that you can assume is going to bet most of the time for you. The other thing is, you're not going to have much incentive to bet your mediocre strength hands. If you flop something like middle pair, if you lead into the pre-flop raiser, you're just letting him fold all of his air that he would have c-bet had you checked to the raiser a very high percent of the time. So your mediocre hands are going to play better by checking and calling, using them as bluff catchers. When you have showdown value, top pair with a bad kicker, middle pair with a good kicker, checking and calling is going to be better than just leading into pre-flop raiser. And if you have a nutted value hand or a huge draw, something you intend to check raise and maybe even get it in on the flop, you still have more incentive to check and let villain pre-flop raiser, that is, bet than to lead yourself. So if you're not leading with your value hands and you're not leading with your mediocre hands and marginal hands, then you can't just always lead when you're bluffing. So if you're not leading with value and you're not leading mediocre, you cannot bluff lead. Hopefully I don't need to explain why that is, but if you don't understand it, just trust me, don't do it. You're going to be extremely exploitable and just playing really face up in bad poker. Pre-flop raiser usually has incentive to bet flop. We could do worse than to c-bet 100% of the time we get heads up in position against pre-flop caller that checks to us, as when we are pre-flop raiser. But hopefully by the end of this video series you'll understand that we can also do a fair bit better than that. We bet for value, we bet as a bluff. Other considerations: if villain paid too high a price to call us pre-flop, we've already made profit, we've already made money, villain has already made a mistake, and locking that equity up with a continuation bet on the flop is rarely a tragic mistake. It would be fantastic if our opponents were always able to make mistakes against us, but sometimes it's just not going to be the way it works out. So in conclusion, we ought to default as standard, normally, c-bet as pre-flop raiser, unless we have a very good reason not to. Now, some of the reasons not to might be checking back to induce bluffs, and it's fine to check back to induce bluffs, but it's not good to check back to induce bluffs if you can't call the bluffs. It's also good to check in order to hopefully get called down lighter, but it's not going to be very good to check something like bottom pair on the flop if we're not going to be able to bet for value later on. So we've defined continuation betting. We've explored it from two different perspectives, from two very different paradigms that both led to the same conclusion, and that is, again, that we should default c-bet unless we have a pretty compelling reason not to. We've discussed c-betting strategy in a toy game forum that did not come to that exact same conclusion, but we've more than anything developed a solid framework and a theoretical foundation that we can build upon while we move through the rest of the material in this video series. Should we default check to the raiser? Default c-bet as pre-flop raiser? Usually. But, well, it depends. What it depends on exactly is going to be covered in great detail in the rest of the video series. I hope you've enjoyed TTOC, the Tao of continuation betting. This is Navanad. Until next time.